Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Strategic Sourcing. My name is Dan Halukas, and this is George Mobilio. I'm going to introduce myself real quick, just a little bit of background, and then George will do the same. And then George will actually kick off the webinar and go through the first half, and I'll take over for the second half and finish it up. So just a little bit about myself. I've been in supply chain for over 22 years, working mainly in CPG companies, Fortune 500 chemical companies, in different aspects of supply chain, from anything from warehousing to production planning, inventory control to sourcing. I also have my CPSM through ISM, and I'm a CPSM certified instructor, have my Six Sigma Green Belt, as well as completing my doctorate in global supply chain currently. So a little bit about myself, and George, I'll turn it over to you for an introduction.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is George Mobilio. I've been in the industry and supply chain for over 30 years, working in various pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, and currently work for a division of Berkshire Hathaway. I'm also a certified ISM instructor, teaching various programs for ISM, from CPSM to sourcing methodology, and the program that we're going to go through today. I have a green belt from Drexel University, and my background from an educational perspective, I have a financial background, undergrad and graduate degree in finance. I'm going to take you through the first half of this session this morning on strategic sourcing. We're going to talk about the methodology and some of the tools used. So I'll take you through about half of this deck, and then Daniel will take you through the back half, and so we're going to get started. So what is strategic sourcing? Strategic sourcing is a disciplined, systematic approach to work through the purchase of materials, goods, and services within a corporation. The objective of strategic sourcing is to align the business requirements with the supply market. Initially, you'll look at your initial supply base of whatever you are purchasing, and then put that through a methodology of a strategic sourcing process based on the need of the organization. Companies, small, large, Fortune 50s, Fortune 500s, Fortune 1000s, will segregate their spend into four common areas. The key is direct materials, which goes into the finished product. Indirect materials, such as office supplies, packaging, computers, etc. Capital equipment. And then, of course, services such as IT, consulting, temporary labor services. Most companies classify them in these four buckets. There is some overlap in some instances. Packaging and transportation will fall into direct materials. In other organizations, that would stay on the indirect side of the goods and services categorization. By segmenting purchases into sourcing groups, as I talked about on the prior page, enables an organization to effectively develop sourcing strategies. A sourcing group is a group of items which are likely to be sourced in the future from the same set of suppliers using similar approaches. So you've got, as this example states, you've got 1,000 plus items, grouping by the technology, application, supplier sources, material content, and within there you identify 50 to 100 major sourcing groups. By identifying these sourcing groups, it allows you to better source a product, better do a market analysis, a supply analysis, and ultimately select the correct suppliers for your organization. Once you build the sourcing groups, you will then put them on this bubble chart on this page here and source them by need. And you'll do a wave sourcing approach. You'll get your I'll call it low-hanging fruit first. So everything that goes in wave one normally is high savings opportunity, ease of implementation. So it's the stuff that you've not touched it maybe at all, or maybe in a few years where you feel you can drive immediate value back to the organization. So you'll get your sourcing groups, however many you have. In this case, there's 17, but it varies by organization. And you'll plot them on the chart again by how easy it is to source, and ease means quick hits, stuff that usually you can do in about 4 to 5 months, as opposed to a longer term 6 to 12-month project. And these will extract the most value back to the business, which will in turn increase the ROI. The output of the planning process on the previous page, on the bubble chart page of the sourcing waves, is listed below. You will lay out a business case outline. You will have an executive summary which talks to your recommendations for senior leadership. Each specific category overview detailing what is comprised in that category. Recommendations for extracting value from the categories in question. What is the benefit analysis of each of those sourcing group, sourcing initiatives, and what is the risk and how do you mitigate the risk as you begin to go through the wave sourcing group process. You then build an implementation plan, which is done in pretty much any project. You will, what is the impact on your current supply base, your current users, your current process? How does it impact it if you were to source plastic bottles? You build a work plan as well as a work team or a project team to work through the particular sourcing group wave. What is your investment plan? How many man hours? What resources? What other types of resources may you need to move this project forward? And then what is your communication plan before the project, during the project, and once the project is completed to your organization, to your external organization, to your senior leaders? And this is the sourcing process that we're going to go through this morning. You have your demand analysis, your supply analysis, your sourcing strategy development, then you select your supplier, and ultimately you do implementation. We'll talk a little bit about phase one demand analysis, where you confirm your strategic and tactical user requirements or your stakeholder requirements. What are their needs, wants, desires? What is currently happening today? And what do they want to happen tomorrow? So an as is and a to be. Determine the linkages to the business strategy. How, by you buying these plastic water bottles, how does that impact the business strategy? How does it push the business strategy forward? Define the category, plastic bottles, and what boundaries you may have in that category in sourcing plastic bottles. Are there specific requirements, specific bottle sizes, specific material types, specific uses for the bottles? And then you get into your data mining phase, where you'll collect and analyze a myriad of data through your MRP systems, through your e-procure tools, whatever MRP system you may have. Is it a homegrown? Is it SAP? Is it Oracle? Are you using Ariba or Coupa, some other bolt-on tool to source whatever data you have? Maybe it's in a manual state. You get that data, and then you begin to do the number crunching to determine how you're going to source this category. Because without data, you really cannot perform a sourcing process. And then you identify whatever constraints, if any, you may have within the organization before you embark on the project. An example on this page of a sourcing category, temporary labor. Most organizations have some form of temporary labor that they have to source within their organization. This example talks to about a $40 million spend, 80 plus suppliers. No one knows who the internal owner is, and the category has never been sourced. So this is a pure wave one category, high spend impact, and on the surface, high return because it's never been sourced. There's 80 plus suppliers, a tremendous opportunity to leverage this $40 million. And one of the first steps you'll do is slice and dice this category into its subcategories. So temporary labor in this example consists of your technical labor, your professional specialty labor, your general office or admin labor, your industrial or light industrial or plant workers, and then your environmental. And then you categorize it out by the various levels of impact within the organization and the types of jobs within each of those subcategories. So you can begin to understand how much of the 40 million is in each of those five, and maybe it's more than five. But in this example, it's saying there are five subcategories that comprise the 40 million, and the expected margin levels where you're going to get your highest return after you do this sourcing category are in your top two, your technical and professional support. When you get to your lesser hourly rates, your office clerical, your industrial, and your and then on the environmental, it'll have less of an impact. The environmental is probably third in line, but your IT support, your consultants, your SAP consultants, your Oracle consultants, professional staff ranging from, attorneys, accountants, and then your engineers, obviously they're paid the highest, so you're going to extract the most value from a markup perspective when you begin to source this through the various temporary staffing firms. Or if it's technical support, it could just be consulting firms. If it's just accounting, it could be the accounting firms that you work with. It does, some of this stuff under temporary staffing also could fall in a separate category by itself. It could actually be an individual sourcing group. In this case, they've bundled it all together under temporary staffing. As we move into phase two in the sourcing methodology process, the supply analysis, you have your segmenting the market, you analyze the market forces, and I'll take you through a small piece of that, and then Daniel will walk you through the balance. Develop supply market evolution. You identify who the key players are. So if you're in the temp labor space, you know who you're buying from through your 80 plus suppliers, but there's very possible that there's some regional players or some national global players that you may not be dealing with, or maybe some niche players who you are presently not sourcing through. You then generate a supplier portfolio. You define the universe, who's out there. You screen potentials for your needs, and then you develop an RFI or a fact sheet on the suppliers that you have interest in. The supply market is segmented by identifying common causes for differentiation within the market. You've got cost structure reasons, sales volume, geographic, the various distribution channels, the depth and breadth of an organization's product line, technology, process innovation, quality, of course, price, the supplier strategy, and some other key components. At the end of the day, this rounds into the total cost of ownership of what you're going to be looking for when you source a particular category. My last slide, and there are about 5 or 6 slides here, but I'm going to just touch on this one and then kind of the rest feed off of this slide, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel. One of the things we do here in the sourcing methodology, step 2, phase 2, is a 5 forces analysis, which uncovers the various opportunities to help the supply manager, the supply professional, extract the most value from a particular category, in this case, temporary labor. And then by its name, 5 forces, it's actually the Porter's 5 forces model. There are 5 forces that impact the supply advantage. There is bargaining power of the supplier. Are they a Google? Are they an Apple? Who are they? The bargaining power of us, the buyer. Are we a Fortune 50? Are we a small regional player? Are we one of the largest tech buyers in the world, as an example? Threat of substitute products. Is there a major threat to an iPhone, a Samsung Galaxy, an LG? What is the threat to the supply base, which potentially could impact the overall total cost of ownership, which is being offered to you, the buyer? And is there an ease of new entry or a threat of new entrants into this market, whatever that supply category market is? Are these new areas you need to look at throughout your sourcing process? And all of this combines to combine into a competitive rivalry. The 5 forces analysis is very important and a very key step in step 2 of the sourcing process. And before I turn it over to Daniel, I just wanted to make one more point, which I omitted to make earlier. We are discussing a 5-step sourcing process. Corporations have a 5-step through I've seen as large as a 9-step. The only difference in those steps is that they've expanded out some of the steps that we have combined into 5. You end up at the same result. They just categorize them differently. They'll break out contracting into negotiation and contracting. They'll break out implementation and then talk about supplier relationship management and then continuous improvement. So they take various steps to kind of break it out. I will now turn it over to Daniel to take you through the rest of the slides, and I'll just move through the Porter's 5 forces and turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you, George. So basically kind of expounding on that a little bit from what George said on the 5 forces, right? When you're taking a look at this, and I'm going to go into some details, some of which George covered on the staffing piece, but taking a look at, for instance, supplier power, right? So you've got staffing firms are highly dependent upon worker availability. So when you go through this process, you're looking at it from a demographic, logistical standpoint, right? Where's the talent pool located in relation to where you have your current facility or where you might place a facility when it comes to location decisions, right? So that's something that factors into that. When you talk about buyer power, shifting towards that contingent workforce is something we're seeing more of. So companies are trending that way from a limit of liability standpoint, from a cost standpoint, from a flexibility standpoint, and they're trying to go more than multi-regional when it comes to a supplier of choice for that support. When you're looking at a threat of substitute, basically only available alternatives generally are more expensive. It's really taking a look at the supply base and saying, okay, are we going to move? If we're going to move, what's the cost benefit, right? What's the situation when it comes to what we're going to be paying, and what's the justification for the move? Taking a look at threat of new entrants, it's all about the barriers to entry, right? So if we have few barriers to entry or exit, that's a good thing, right? So the least amount of barriers, the better from a determination standpoint. Supply market rivalry, when it comes to the acquisition efforts, they're strong, right? So what is your company trying to do for that specific category? Are they looking to acquire companies within the next 3 or 4 years, and that's their goal to reach a certain amount by, say, 2020, right? From an objective standpoint from the company, what's the goal? What are you trying to do? What's the growth goal from a percentage? If you take a look on the bottom, it's 16% per annum. Is that the goal for this year? Is it the goal for next year? What's the objective of what you're trying to do? So, George, I'll move on to the next slide. The market will continue to expand as corporations focus on core competencies. So you can take a look here from the different decades, kind of on the metamorphosis of the industry, right? Looking at the 80s, you've got the jobs. You can see how the jobs are increasing. You can see how the industry size has exponentially grown. From the growth driver standpoint, you could take a look at focus on the 80s from an inflation standpoint, focus on the 90s when it comes to business and outsourcing. Actually, at that point, more than a buy versus make at that standpoint and trying to go to a third party. Where in the 2000s, like George was alluding to and myself, the temp labor contingent workforce piece is now a pretty big focus of a lot of companies. They have a lot of spend in that area. They're going towards that. And to save on fully loaded cost of an employee from benefits to everything else, it seems to make more sense. So they're going that way for a lot of different services and support. If you take a look at the supplier piece from the 80s, it was more fragmented. It was more tactical, focusing on those lower level positions. Where in the 90s, it was how can we consolidate? How can we basically have a supplier base that's more regional, say, than local, right? Possibly global as well. How do we specialize as well? What are we finding out as far as core competencies of suppliers? Can a supplier satisfy our requirements? And if so, do they subcontract with other suppliers that can satisfy additional requirements as well? So does it make sense to go with them from a strategic standpoint? Going into 2000s, the consolidation continued, but now there's an increased specialization, right? So you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket when it comes to supply base, but maybe it's 2 or 3 suppliers from a preferred supplier pool that you can lean on that have those competencies, right? That now are the ones you're going to use as a default for your business. You can take a look at the growth rate, 11% to 16 to now kind of being consistent and plateauing between the 10 to 15% growth, which is pretty consistent now throughout the 2000s. So George, I'll move on to the next slide. Moving on to the next phase of the sourcing process, we're going to talk about the sourcing strategy. Taking a look at the complexity of the market, the portfolio as far as capabilities. How do you get that supplier list from, say, 15 to 5 to 3? From the sourcing strategy, how do you develop that strategy, right? What feeds into it, and how do you roll it out? So we're going to go through some of that. George, you can move on to the next slide. So sourcing strategy development is really 2 steps, right? If we take a look at the left, which we call the Krychek model, you're looking at different quadrants of where to put your categories, right? If your category is strategic, it goes on the top right. If it's a bottleneck, it goes on the bottom right. So when you have your categories from IT to marketing to sales to travel, whatever it may be, you want to place them in this matrix because it's going to show what the current situation is of that category, right? So now you know this is where we are, this is where we stand, this is the type of category we think it is, so therefore we can basically design category around that. Going on to step 2, it's identifying sourcing strategy and tactics, right? So you could see it's a spider type matrix. You could see strategic sourcings at the center. You could see the different legs that come off of that, right? Global sourcing being one of them. Relationship restructuring is something from a supplier relationship management piece that's been pretty prevalent in the 2000s. And it's really about partnering with suppliers. In prior years, it was about supplier being a vendor. Now it's about the supplier being a partner. It went back to vendor, and now it's back to partner, actually, as far as the relationship with a client. So now it's how do we share with the supplier in possible profits and losses, right? Is there a gain share approach? Is there a recovery approach? what can you do to make sure that that supplier feels like they're part of the team? Can you bring them in early, from an early supplier involvement? We call it ESI when it comes to projects, right? How do we get them engaged on an earlier basis and make them more of a partner? Is it a longer term contract? So what are you doing to make them feel like they're part of the company? That's really, when it comes to relationships now, that's more of a focus with large corporations, actually, I think more than it's ever been. When we talk about product specification improvement, it's also taking a look at your specifications, say for a product if you're launching an RFP, and getting a consultant to weigh in on it now. Having a consultant come in and actually proofread your requirements. Do they make sense? What can you add? What can you delete? What needs to be revised? So now corporations are moving towards consultancies when it comes to building specifications so that they can get back a more qualified result and support their business objectives more accurately. So that's a trend that's actually starting off, because companies are willing to spend that money on specification improvement if there's a return on investment. So if a large consultancy comes in and says, we'll put this together for you, but we think we can save you 10 to 20% off your budget, now you have an ROI, right, that you can sell into the business and say, well, we're spending $100,000, but we're going to get $200,000 or $300,000 back on what we're going to save by doing this process. So you've got that intrinsic value that you could pass along to the business, and it shows that you're trying to support the business from a value add standpoint. Move on to the next slide. Kind of expounding on that a little bit with the criticality, you could take a look, for instance, if you're going to have a category that's strategic, which we'll use IT as an example, it could have some high complexity, but it could have a high impact. If you're sourcing software from a license standpoint, there could be some complexity there when you're dealing with suppliers and relationships with other suppliers from an IT standpoint, and how you have to manage the second and third tier, how you have to manage some of the integration of the systems. There could be some complexity there as far as also finding that right supplier from the market that's going to support those requirements. From a business impact standpoint, sticking with IT, it could be large, right? Because if something happens to your systems and your information flow, you could have issues with your email, issues with your databases. Things could get corrupt, you could get hacked. There's all kinds of things that can happen if you're not secure, that can affect the business from a disruption standpoint. So your impact could be very big if your systems aren't secure, your data's not doesn't have data, you don't have data integrity, it's not cleansed. There could be issues there. So basically, looking at that from a strategic standpoint, IT can fall into that category. When you look at something from a leverage standpoint, you might be able to look at a category such as travel. Right, so you can still have a large business impact on travel, because if people can't book a flight and get to their locations, there could be issues from a disruption standpoint as well. From a market complexity standpoint, basically you're trying to leverage what you have from a volume standpoint. So if you're working with a supplier, say for travel, you're leveraging not only airline volume, but you're leveraging car volume, you're leveraging hotel volume, right? Whatever you can leverage from that supplier to support your business based on your different components of spend is going to give you the highest impact, but it might not be that complex. It might be that simple based on the nature of the business. So we can move on. So when you're taking a look at different approaches, category teams go through an analysis. So they go through looking at buying power and finding a way to create advantage, right? So going back to that strategic sourcing spider type matrix, you could see it in the middle, and just focusing on global sourcing for a second. Usually when it comes to global suppliers, as far as a component of your spend, it's usually about 20 or 25%, right, of your supply base and your spend. That's really focusing on global. The rest of it is local/regional. Right, so it's really, even though you want to try to get as global as you can, there's a lot of situations where you just can't do that. You might not be able to roll out global suppliers, for instance, because they don't have the footprint in certain countries. they can't adjust to the different government regulations or legal systems of certain countries. So because of that, business units are using localized regional suppliers that they know can support the business and give the best pricing. So from a global sourcing standpoint, you try to do it as much as you can from a economies of scale standpoint, but it might not always be the case, and a lot of times you find yourself doing a hybrid approach of a global/regional solution to specific project initiatives. Talking about best practice evaluation, that is a trend that's been around for years, and it's continually evolving. It's all about trends and consultancy now when it comes to the sourcing area, right? So now companies are saying we want to make sure we have the best practices, so make sure you find the best subject matter expert to do that. It could be, one of the large consultancies that have been around for years. It could be retired individuals that have 20 or 30 years of experience who can bring in that level of expertise that have worked at large companies before. But either way, you're trying to bring in best practices from larger companies than the company you're currently working with, because that's optimally, right, where you're trying to go from a goal standpoint. So from a best practice standpoint, it's what's the gold standard? How do we get there? What are the steps needed? Do we need to throw money at the problem? Do we need to throw resources at the problem? How do we get to that situation? What do we need to do? What steps do we need to take? Do we need to restaff? Whatever it may be. But you want to make sure that from a procedural standpoint, from a process standpoint, that you're implementing what's out there as far as the best practices. And there's a lot of ways to do that, right? You can go through RFPs for that. You can go through for instance, ISM and leverage their network when it comes to experts as far as asking questions and getting that, go to different symposiums. There's different ways to gather that information and then get executive buy-in within your company and implement. We talked about the project specification piece. The volume concentration, again, is about the economies of scale. Where can you leverage volume? If it's not globally, can you go from local to regional? Right? That might be a logical step. That might be a more tolerable change for the business. And by doing that, you might be able to save a lot. It could be, I'll give you an example with mobile carriers. You could be moving from a country to a regional approach on mobile carriers for your phones. Global doesn't really apply there. But by doing that, I've seen in the past some pretty big savings coming from country to regional approach when it comes to volume concentration. That's something to keep in mind. George, next slide. Predetermined set of criteria are used to objectively evaluate potential suppliers. So how are you going to evaluate these suppliers? What are the criteria you're going to use? Is it technical expertise? Is it pricing? Is it years of experience in general? What are you going to use? And that's where the business feeds into that. The business is going to help determine from a scoring matrix standpoint what the percentages are, what the weighted average is. Is it 20% for pricing as far as how you evaluate the suppliers? Is it 30% for technical expertise? What are you going to assign that to? And the business will populate that criteria, and they'll also do the scoring when the RFPs come back. So they'll score, let's say, on a 0 to 5, 5 being the best score on where they see that supplier, where procurement will weigh in and give advice and counsel on pricing. They'll give it based on capability. So they'll feed into that scoring matrix as well. If there's grading that occurs by the business that's off from a pricing standpoint, or something doesn't make sense, procurement's job is to challenge and question that. Right? So from a procurement standpoint, we're taking a look at it through an objective lens. We need to make sure that these scoring matrices are completed prior to the RFP coming back, so that when the responses are returned, at that point, the scoring can take place right away. So here are some different examples of criteria that different companies, categories can use on how they're going to judge the responses from the suppliers. Next slide. getting back into that bottleneck approach, the types of services or categories and strategies are developed. So this is basically saying, where are we dropping in some of those categories, right? And it's very subjective based on where the company goes. Like I mentioned before with IT and strategic, here they've got IT and leverage, right? So it depends on how your company's focusing on those categories from a prioritization standpoint on where those subcategories and categories are dropped into this matrix, because that's going to be based on your strategy. If your strategy is to have that category as strategic and that's the kind of focus you want to have and that's how you see it reflecting on the business, that's where it needs to be. Next slide. Moving on to the fourth phase with supplier selection. We talked about the RFP. We have to make sure the RFP is created from a requirement standpoint, which is what the business puts together. The negotiation strategy comes from procurement. What do we want to focus on? Are we focusing on some of the cost drivers? Are we focusing on some of the capabilities? Is it a combination of both? What are the priorities you want to focus on as far as the must-haves when it comes to the negotiation piece? Evaluate your proposals, right? We talked about that from a scoring matrix standpoint. And, you know, the scoring matrix standpoint could have operational compliance, commercial compliance, could have different business content, support-related topics. Negotiate and select the supplier. So once you select the supplier, it's pending contract execution and price refinement. So at that point, you need to go in and you can additionally award a supplier, and now you can try to negotiate the price even further than you have previously. So is there anything you can do with that supplier to get them down in price to finalize the contract? And then once that's done, you go through the legal phase and the compliance phase, risk assessment, possibly security, and make sure that that contract is vetted through the proper channels. It gets the business buy-off, legal approves all the terms with the suppliers, legal, they have conversations, and at that point, the contract's executed and signed on both sides by parties with the proper global authority limitation when it comes to signing authority from a monetary standpoint. And then at that point, the implementation starts. You start rolling out the program throughout the organization and putting feet on the ground from the supplier, and implementation begins. Move to the next section. Disciplined supplier selection process was used. So when it comes to suppliers for an RFP, you try to get down to what's called a competitive bid. So you try to get down to 3 suppliers if you can for the bid. And the reason why you want to have 3 is because if a third supplier could be a tiebreaker, right? So if you have 2 suppliers, the third one could be the one that makes the difference or sets itself apart. Suppliers responding, you know, we want to make sure suppliers respond within a timely manner. The responses want to be as apples to apples as possible, from making sure you've got a very clean pricing matrix or fields to be populated within, say, your Ariba portal if you're using it, or other kind of online system for them to bid, so that it's very simple. You don't want to have to go back and talk to suppliers and try to finalize what the pricing is from an analytical comparison standpoint. You want to have it very clean, very simple, so they can populate certain fields and everything comes out apples to apples. You get down to your short list, like we said. You could start off in an RFP at 10 to 15 suppliers and get it down hopefully to 5 and then to 3. Invite them to negotiate. You can have some demos with the business. Have them come in and give their capabilities presentation. Have them come in and also present their proposal. Then, of course, the selection process like we discussed. Next slide. So this talks about the power of procurement and the power of actually having an RFP, right? So sometimes when you're working with suppliers, if you've been working with a supplier as an incumbent that you've been using for years, and they know you're not going out to bid, and you're just single source negotiating and going back and trying to negotiate the existing agreement, your leverage is minimal. You're negotiating from a position of weakness, and you're not going to have that leverage to really make a difference when it comes to the pricing that's in place. Whereas sometimes just simply putting a company through an RFP process gives them a heightened sense of awareness and competitive intensity where at that point they basically feel the need to reduce their prices to be competitive, because now they want to hold on to the business they have. They realize that it's not something that's a given for them to keep it, and at that point, sometimes you'll see them come back with 5 to 15% less than they currently had, based on attempts to keep the business. They might also come back with additional services they weren't providing free of charge, in an attempt to do that as well. So this kind of gives you just a side-by-side on what happens with the current, what happens maybe through an RFP on negotiated pricing with procurement, and you can see some of the variations from a overall average of the industry. Next slide. Moving on to the last phase, like I talked about, after contract execution, you're going into implementation. You're going into the selection process, the agreement, and continuous improvement. So what do you do after the fact? As far as once the supplier is rolled out, once the contract's executed, the implement is going through its phases. At that point, where does procurement fall in the process? And we'll go through that in a minute. Next slide. Some of the intangible benefits when you talk about this is single point of contact. From a supplier standpoint, that's what you want. You want to have that single point of contact on both sides, from the client to the supplier. If you can have somebody on site, from a supplier standpoint, they can have their own office. From a direct point of contact and a timing standpoint, support standpoint, that'd be phenomenal, especially when it comes to, an example is travel, and you're supporting the executives. Having somebody on site to support the executive admin roles is very crucial for travel and could be very helpful. So that's something to keep in mind for certain categories. Talking about worker quality guaranteed. From a supplier standpoint, they need to make sure that the quality of the labor force is consistent and is ever improving, and that can surpass whatever your requirements may be. Reduce sourcing efforts and costs. At that point, you're basically fine-tuning what the costs are. You're not having to source as much at that point, because now the supplier has been selected. You're comfortable with the supplier for hopefully a multi-year agreement, at least 2 years, and at that point, you can focus on other initiatives. Uniform management reports. This talks to compliance, which is extremely important. Making sure that you're getting accurate reporting, timely reporting, reporting that can be validated through audits, to help make sure that your company is compliant with their policies and procedures. Extremely important from an audit standpoint. Next slide. Implementation and contingency. Each supplier can back up the other for specialty resources. A lot of times you want to have, like I said, a preferred supplier pool. So you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. Even though you've chosen that supplier, you're in contract with that supplier, you also want to know that there's another supplier that you might give a portion of the business to that can back that supplier up. So therefore, you don't want to be exclusive with any supplier, because at that point, you won't be able to have a legitimate backup, because if something goes wrong with that supplier, if they go bankrupt, if there's negative media exposure or corruption, whatever it may be, now you're in trouble in finding a new supplier. Whereas if you had a company that was doing 10 or 20% of your business, and they have the ability to expand, you can ramp them up. Client satisfaction surveys are key. It's the best way it's the best report card really to gauge how your supplier is doing and gauge how your clients support. Your clients are satisfied or not satisfied with the support. Travel is another example I'll bring up, where you go out to the actual end users or travelers and the travel arrangers, and you ask them, how has that supplier been working for you? How is the ease of booking online? What happens when you pick up the phone and call a customer service rep? Are you getting a timely response? Do they know your name? It could be as simple as that. Can they pull up your information quickly? Do you feel you're getting the best pricing? Right? So it's really checking with the business owners and making sure that they're satisfied with the support and service of the supplier. Then you talk about your performance reports and reviews, and this is basically the state of the business, taking a look at how much money have they saved you over the quarter and how have they saved it. How do they feel the implementation is going? What are some trends that they've just noticed or things they want to maybe implement as far as them keeping an eye out on the market? That's another reason. Next slide. Actually, I believe that's it. So that actually concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all for joining, and you'll be getting a certificate, continuing education certificate for attending this webinar through ISM. Thank you very much.